Thank you very much. I'm told by Kevin that I'm timetabled tonight against Mervyn King of the Bank of England, who's appearing at the Millennium Centre. That's all I can say, is that this is a bit like the established church against the primitive Methodists. Mervyn King clearly has the venue at the Millennium Centre, but I hope tonight we have the enthusiasm in the zinc shack halfway up the hill on the edge of town. And I suppose some of that enthusiasm is reflected, I hope, in my title, How Wales Can Win. Because some of the stuff we're going to be looking at tonight is pretty depressing stuff about sustained decline. But my story is also about new possibilities. And there's lots more of this stuff if you want to have a look at the Crest website. But I think the fundamental I want to put to you tonight is that we need a new imaginary. We need to think about new kinds of possibilities. Because if you look at the stranded ex-industrial regions and districts across Northern Europe, there's no precedent or template for fixing these problems. You think, for example, not only about Wales, but about Wallonia in the south of Belgium, or the West Midlands, which metrics really in many ways worse than Wales. Or the dispersion of the problem, the fact we work with Enfield Council in North London, which has 5 miles of light industrial dereliction down the middle of the borough. And the fact it's political as much as economic, as you can see in Belgium or Spain, where there are tensions within a federal state. So we need, I think, to start shifting the limits on what's thinkable and doable, and to think about regional and local initiatives, because I don't think the central state's going to sort your problems this time. And we also need to think about possibilities of what I call guerrilla development, focused on the foundational economy. The economy which serves everyday life in an unfashionable way. Supermarkets, buses, and all the rest of that stuff. And my argument is that Wales can win, or at least do much better, by focusing on foundational activities and managing what's left in places like Llanelli or the valleys. So, as it's a general public audience, there are rather more subdivisions so that you don't lose your way in the argument. So, 5 steps to this argument. First, I'm going to talk about the agreed mess after 2008, how our worsening regional problems are nested in a stalled UK economy. Then I'm going to talk a bit about what's lost and what's left, and how we need to gestalt flip, so that we focus on the foundational economy, the everyday economy. Then I'm going to talk a bit about how the central state lacks the and technical capability to solve your problems. And then to the key section, which is, if you're focused on the foundational economy, what kinds of principles would you wish to apply to its management about ending fragmentation and curbing value extraction? And finally, a question about whether the Welsh Government is up to the challenge. Let's start with the agreed mess. Because there is an agreed mess, how our long-standing regional problems have now taken a turn for the worse. The story after 79 is of 30 years of falling behind by the output per capita measure, GVA, gross value added. And indeed, it's a problem not simply for Wales, but it's a problem for everywhere in the UK outside London. In this period of time, it's only London which has been creating large numbers of full-time jobs. And most of those have gone to immigrants, 85% in the 15 years before 2008. Very different from the 20s and the 30s, when there's this diaspora from Wales to Coventry, Oxford, and light manufacturing. And here's a very nice example of the problem. We graph London as 100 in 1989 and 2009, and we look at Wales, 54% in 1989, 43% fallen behind. And you can actually look at the West Midlands, 59 to 49, and some people find that consoling. There are at least 3 other regions which have done as badly as Wales. I think that's not very much consolation at all. And post-2008, we are really entering a period of freefall, because the fiscal cuts, the 81 million cuts from Osborne, actually are anti-regional because they're cuts in publicly funded employment and in the welfare, which was supporting 18 to 20% of your working age population. The one thing I'd like to add about this mess that we're looking at is that it's now taking place in the context of a stalled national economy. Because one of the big problems many people have is, how come the economy appeared to be working up to 2008, and then suddenly it was all failing? Well, here's the answer in 2 slides. This one compares housing equity withdrawal, the value of remortgage on existing properties, with the change in GDP. And as you see, under both Thatcher and Blair, the value of housing equity withdrawal is larger than GDP. In other words, the whole country was remortgaging on the back of rising house prices. And the whole country was behaving like a feckless, irresponsible private equity fund in the 2000s, cashing out on a rising market of securities. That's where the consumption feel-good came from. We were all remortgaging our property. The other aspect of the economy is, where did the jobs come from? Now, we've worked on this for several years, and it's very difficult to actually present one diagram which gives you a long-term view. So what we actually did here is we've actually looked at, we've actually looked at education, public administration, and health as a proxy for publicly employed or publicly funded jobs. That covers not only people working in the NHS, but people working in a care home, because they're in health. And the really interesting thing is to look at where the extra jobs, the new jobs, came from. And if you look at Thatcher and Major period, 86% of the new jobs were in these sectors. These sectors where it's either public employment or public funding of private employment. Even in the Blair-Brown boom, 59.9% of the jobs came out of state funding. So the economy worked up to 2008 because we were remortgaging our houses on a rising housing market, and because the state was essentially spending on health, education, and welfare to fund the job creation. And so we are in a fix. And the question is, how do we kind of think our way out of the problem? How do we reframe intervention? And I'm going to suggest that we look at the foundational economy. But first of all, I wanted to show you a gestalt. And it's Ludwig Wittgenstein's favorite gestalt, actually. And the thing is, you can read the picture in 2 ways. First of all, it's a duck, isn't it? Everybody see the duck? Mm-hmm. Secondly, if that's the duck's beak. And what else can you see in it?
Rabbit.
A rabbit, yes, of course. That's the rabbit's mouth. And, typically when you look at this, you first see one thing and then have to struggle a little to see the other, because we actually have a very strong attachment in these Gestalt figures to seeing it one way, and you've really got to kind of refocus to get to the other thing. I'm going to suggest that we need to make a perceptual Gestalt flip, and that we've got preoccupied in this country and in Wales with what's lost and not with what's left. And what's lost is manufacturing, and what's left is the foundational economy. Now, if we look at manufacturing, the story nationally is dead simple. When I was in university, manufacturing employed 7 million people. It now employs 2.25 million and falling. And this has been a disaster for the male organised working class. It's been a disaster for supply chains around manufacturing, and it's been a disaster for manufacturing PLCs, of which we have almost none left at all, apart from Rolls-Royce. But what's left? Very interestingly, what's left is a foundational economy of mundane activities. Supermarkets, utilities, buses, that kind of stuff, which, as we'll see in a moment, maintains employment of roughly 10 million in the UK. It's mainly not tradable, it's sheltered, i.e. it's not open to low-wage Asian competition. It's one way or another politically franchised, directly with things like trains, indirectly with supermarkets, where it all depends on the planning regime. And it very interestingly is distributed according to population. You've got to have it as long as the population sticks in a place. And there are all kinds of unrecognised aspects of this. Like apparently the University of Manchester is now the largest employer of male unskilled workers in the city of Manchester. Who'd have thought that? And I think that therefore you may want to think about the size of this network that supports us all, this network that we take for granted. Who thinks about standing at the supermarket in the queue? The largest element of it is health, education, and welfare, what the Americans call EDS and MEDS. And if you look at all the high-income countries, and we've looked at Australia, the US, and the UK, all of them have their expansion of employment not in knowledge and creative, but in EDS and MEDS. And in the UK, this involves the state and the parastate, because after Blair, increasingly, we put public funding to support things like old people's in homes, who actually, homes are not local authority homes, but they're privately run nursing homes. The parastate is now, on some measures, equal to 1/3 the size of direct state employment. Now, in the UK as a whole, this accounts for 6.5 million, 6.7 million, and in Wales for around 400,000. And the thing that strikes you, of course, is that as you get less successful, like West Wales, so the dependence on the state and the parastate actually increases. This is typical of an unsuccessful region. 1/3 of the jobs depend on public funding, and they're in health, education, and welfare. There's also a very interesting story about mundane private sector activities. The activities, I think, which are necessary to everyday life and used by everybody, regardless of income or social status. Electricity, gas, water, supermarkets, basic food processing, local transport. And interestingly enough, this is about 10% of the workforce everywhere in England and Wales, because it kind of sticks. It's distributed according to population. It's actually quite interesting to look at what the private sector mundane is dominated by. The largest single element is supermarkets and big box retailing, accounting for 4.5% of Welsh employment. And then you've got things like bread and biscuits, 1.2% of employment. You know, really boring stuff on an industrial estate somewhere near you. And I think that nobody really has actually thought very much about the foundational economy. Though in places like Cardiff and the valleys, it's all we've bloody well got left. And it's also very interesting because there's a good deal of overlap. If you say that much of this is mundane, of course, most of state health, education and welfare is mundane. There are more primary school teachers than university lecturers. And of course, the mundane dominates British manufacturing, where the largest sector remaining in British manufacturing is food processing, sausages and all the rest of that. So there's a large foundational economy. And that's, I think, the economic lever that could be worked upon if we want to think about new possibilities. But also, I think, if we want to think about possibilities, we're interested in political possibilities. And I want to talk now about whether or not the central state will sort it out for you, or whether the central state, as I will argue, lacks political will and technical capacity. So here's another gestalt to keep you awake. Now this is a much less politically correct gestalt, and was widely used in introductory psychology lectures of 40 years ago. And it's the old woman and the young lady. Can everybody see the young lady? She's looking away from us. She looks very elegant indeed, and that's her chin, and that's her eye, and that's her ear. Now you can also see this as the old witch. The two eyes and the long hooked nose. Now this is no doubt politically much more incorrect than it was when I was given this as a student. But it does make, I think, a point about the central state, where we tend, I think, to see the fair young lady rather than the awful old witch. And I think if we ask whether the central state is here to help, the first thing we have to say is you've got to stop thinking about the state versus the market in abstract, generic terms. And you've got to think of the state and its apparatus in particular periods. And I would argue that our assumptions about the central state being here to help are a kind of hangover, an anachronism, a kind of halo effect from the 40s to the 70s, when the central state was part of the solution. The UK social settlement after the war was, of course, Keynes and Beveridge and Barlow on regional policy. Let's remember that in a department of planning. Now, you may actually wish to dispute the exact cause-effect relations, but nevertheless, regional policy had a major impact. Think of the new towns, think about all the relocation of industry policies in the 60s and all the rest of it. An active central state from the 40s to the 70s, which was here to help struggling regions. Under the Thatcher and Blair, I think it's altogether more ambiguous what's going on, because neither of them, by any measure, shrinks the state. By the simplest measure of share of expenditure, the state actually expands under Blair and Thatcher. But what they do is they dismantle the social settlement, undermine the organised working class by flexibilisation and privatisation. And they then diminish regional policy to the point where it becomes a fig leaf, so that regional policy is, in the mantra, making the market work better and supplying infrastructure and training. That is all you're allowed to do in the world of Thatcher and Blair. And I would argue, in a way, that quite clearly the infrastructure and training was not adequate to the problem that was emerging, and that worse still, the central state is now actively part of the problem. To start off with, I don't think the central state has any political will to fix the regional problem. And there are various reasons for this. The main one is the decline of mass parties. Both the Labour and the Conservative Party have lost 80% plus of their membership in the last 40 years, since the 1970s. They now are Westminster factions of professionalised politicians whose idea is to pitch to swing voters, hence the absolutely indistinguishable party conferences this September. And if they're a long way away from the voters, they are very close to London finance, which explains their contributions. 50% of Tory funding comes from city sources, and most of that comes not from companies, but from individual hedge fund and private equity fund managers. And they have a large influence on the policy of the state. So politically, the state is distracted, and economically, it's got many different policies, but I think none of the existing central state policies can sort the mess that we're in, and many of them will, I think, make it worse. Let me first of all talk about macro management. Now, in a way, what came out of the two previous crises that we had in the 30s and the 70s was what I call thermostatic macro management. You know, like your central heating, it would produce a nice equable temperature. Some regions would do better than others, but the government was responsible after the 30s recession for growth and full employment, and after the 70s crisis, the government took responsibility for low inflation. Now, all this has failed. The government is no longer capable of producing a warm bath which would be positive even for struggling regions. We can see in this country and right across Europe that the fiscal brake of austerity doesn't so far reduce debt, and growth recedes into the infinite future. And some people talk about Plan B, and I'd like to see the Keynesian accelerator pressed. But this is a country which has 100 billion per annum trade deficit and is obliged to impress the bond markets. The degree to which you can floor the accelerator in the Keynesian way is clearly seriously limited. And what we've seen so far, in a way, apart from the fact we don't have a policy, is quite bizarre, because the policy of the last couple of years has been wild improvisation, not precision engineering. For example, if you're cutting from the economy expenditure or injecting expenditure, the first thing you need to know is what the multiplier is. The IMF puts the multiplier in the British economy anywhere between 0.5 and 2. And there's a widespread supposition that the OBR has got it wrong quite substantially. But we're not relying on fiscal policy, we're relying on ultra-loose monetary policy. 0% interest rates plus 375 billion of quantitative easing, which appears to have done nothing for the real economy and left us with Bank of England holding a balance sheet of securities equal to 25% of GDP. It's quite stunning. I mean, typically a central bank balance sheet would equal 5% of GDP max. They've been buying all kinds of stuff for the last couple of years and ended up with a balance sheet equal to 25% of GDP without much discernible effect on the real economy. You know, there are all kind of surreal aspects to this. Like the largest purchaser of government gilt bonds in the UK over the last 18 months is the Bank of England. We issue the paper and we buy it ourselves. Not simply don't we have policies, either austerity or Keynesian accelerator, but there's, people are in a sense banging the controls about and just seeing what happens. And, this is very far from the notion of economic management. And what we've got is a kind of new cargo cult, because the really interesting thing is when you're absolutely buggered with your macroeconomics, what you do is you project export-led recovery. And you may remember that this was what the OBR did in 2010, 2011, and you'll be amused to find that the Rajoy government in Spain, which is absolutely buggered if you look at the macro projections, projects 6% export growth as far as the eye can see. You will also, those of you who've read that admirable pamphlet, Offers Gap from Reply, will realise that it has an exemplary analysis of Wales' relative decline, which ends with the prospect of an export boom, where we will sell education and health service management to the English and solve all our problems. I mean, macroeconomic management is in a mess, and there is no realistic prospect of the warm bath, economic growth, and all the rest of that. And I guess, in a sense, what we now have is, faced with all those problems, what people do once that, it looks like the world is a dark and dangerous place. They want to go back to mummy, in a sense. They want to recover what's lost. And there are two versions of this. There's a right-wing version, which says what we've lost is enterprise, and that's what we need to put back. And there's a centrist and a centre-left version, which says what we've lost is world-leading sectors. Now, the enterprise thing, of course, is essentially the Maoism of the right. The revolution fails because it is incomplete. And if we were to add regional pay scales and remove all planning restrictions in the south of England, we'd be all right. Now, there are clearly some people on the Tory backbenches who believe that. But I don't think there are many people in the regions who believe that. And many of us, I think, would see that regional pay scales are quite likely to lead to a withdrawal of purchasing power in Merthyr Tydfil and places of that sort, without encouraging any commensurate expansion in the private sector. And, in some sense also the whole thing is played against Sam. I mean, people of a certain age in this audience will no doubt be amused to see that we've rediscovered enterprise zones, which some of us were working on how they didn't work in the late 1980s. That's one version, and I don't think that's going to help losing regions. There's then the centre-left's world-leading new sectors. Now, there are all kinds of versions of this, and some of them are very sophisticated and involve networks, innovation culture, smart institutions and regions, and all the rest of it. And some of it is really, like the investment bank proposals, a kind of foie gras feeding of SMEs. If you ram the money into the SME sector, something good is bound to happen. And I think, this tells us more about hope than anything else. And I think there are three questions about this kind of aspirational future. I wouldn't rubbish it altogether. I think that if you're asked to choose between structural reform or industrial policy, we should back industrial policy for new sectors. But there are three questions about it. Firstly, there's the global question as to whether the digital technologies are transformational general purpose technologies like electricity or the internal combustion engine. And Robert Gordon in the United States has recently written a very good article about that. The digital will allow us to watch TV everywhere and be pursued by our email in the bath. But that doesn't transform LA the way that electricity and the internal combustion engine did. So, and that's one global question. There's then a national question about the problem that we have broken supply chains in manufacturing, and there's a good deal of leakage onto imported components. You may have noticed this triumphalism about how we're now exporting more cars than we import, which both major parties say is a huge policy achievement. What they don't tell you is the imported cars have no British content. The exported cars are 35% by value imported components. So you need to produce three cars instead of 2 cars or whatever, simply to actually stay where you are. And if you actually look at it, we looked at rail engineering, we've looked at pig supply, etc. Everywhere you see that if you actually put money in, it leaks, and it typically leaks not to low-wage Asia, but it leaks to Germany, Sweden, the north of Italy, and places of that sort. Anybody who's worked on food processing knows it's the largest consumer of machinery in the UK, because you can't make a sausage without a complicated machine. Where do all the machines come from? North Italy and South Germany. Dominates the global market. And so you put the money in, and what actually happens is it leaks out. And the final point is, exactly which regions is industrial policy for? If you read the stuff by people like Mariano Mazzucato, or indeed the cable stuff, it's all about world-leading sectors, and it's never about where exactly the sectors are going to be located. Now, if you think about the UK, many of the new sectors are going to be located in the M11 corridor and the Thames Valley. If you look at the kinds of world-leading sectors that people want to encourage, a roundabout somewhere near Cambridge is probably the optimal location. And I don't think there's very much there for Llanelli or Merthyr Tydfil. Now, that's not to say that we shouldn't do it, but that we need to be realistic about what industrial policy will achieve. Its amount of leverage on the Welsh economy is very low indeed. So why don't we think not about where we've been, what's lost? Why don't we stop thinking about the aspirational, the sectors that we could construct? Why don't we focus on the foundational economy, which is the thing that we actually have? And I want to talk now about new possibilities of local and regional development if we focus on the foundational economy. Now, I think there's no reason why the foundational can't become an object of possibility. It's simply about thinking about mundane activities and how we manage their stewardship and sustainability in a time of public expenditure cuts and private value extraction. And indeed, it is only industrial policy and regional policy redone for hard times. Because if you look at it, infrastructure, the mundane stuff, including supermarkets as well as a water network, is central to the quality of life and our social objectives. And the foundational connects with 40% of UK employment. Now, why don't we think about how we organise that, how we manage that? Because that's what we've got left in Wales. And really, also, this is just regional policy revisited. Because you remember Thatcher and Blair, the only thing you could do was perfect the market through infrastructure and trading. Well, if you flip this into an active social democratic kind of mode, what you get is something like the policies I'm going to be recommending in a few minutes. And I think here, I would say, regional and local government has a massive role to play. Partly because I have become convinced in the last 2 years that the central government lacks knowledge and expertise to run an industrial policy. It's done work on things as diverse as rail engineering and train building and meat supply chains. And in each case, what we discover is that the relevant government department essentially has lost sectoral expertise. This is absolutely tragic, and there's a history to be written about how our Whitehall departments are dominated by people who have successfully managed reorganisation and public procurement. And how even under Thatcher, for example, North Sea oil was managed with a local content objective, which secured 80% British content on the rigs in the North Sea. That's why they were building them in Southern Vaud. They didn't simply happen. They were the result of government policy. We now have no expertise on something like pigmeat or rail engineering, where they just simply don't know how the sector works. And, you know, if you say then you need to build knowledge expertise, most distributed activity is best managed at a regional level. The UK is a country of city regions, one way or another. If you want to think about infrastructure, that's the way to manage it. And of course, finally, if you look at the ex-industrial districts, foundational is all that's left to manage. It's the thing that we can actually handle, process, deal with, rather than hope for some digital dividend. So what principles, and this comes, I think, to the crucial business. If you're actually going to say the foundational is the basis of thinking about a new set of possibilities in a region like Wales, what principles of economic organisation would you follow to try and make sure that, in a sense, you organise these things for good jobs, for local value, and all the rest of them? And I'm going to give you two principles. First of all, curbing fragmentation, which is really a physical principle, mostly. And secondly, I'm going to talk about ending value extraction. Now, in the Thatcher-Blair imaginary, what we needed was competition and markets. And what we ended up with is a fragmented economy of profit centres. Now, this is most obvious on an everyday basis with privatised trains. But it's also, of course, the coalition's vision of the future of the public sector. Academy schools or the Lansley health reforms are about the profit centre economy. This fragmentation of people running profit centres is always invariably associated with the claim the private sector will bring in investment, and the outcome that the private sector sits on its hands and doesn't invest. Now, if I had another hour, I could discuss at length the pathology of broadband, which is the infrastructure of the future in the UK, and why in Cardiff Virgin and BT run parallel networks down every street, whereas in Rhyadr or Llanidloes, you'd be very lucky. Now, this is an example of duplication to try and capture the prime market. And it's associated with a pathological competition, because as you must have noticed, the guys are not selling you broadband, they're selling you bundles with your TV, your phone, and your broadband all mixed together, sometimes with your mobile and your landline phone. Now, the essence of this is the number one driver is sports content. So that BT is currently spending more each year on buying sporting rights for broadband offers to people like you than is actually investing physically in the broadband network. This is completely screwy. What the country needs is not competition on bundles of TV products, most of which, of course, you don't want. But what the country needs is a broadband network, like the electricity grid and network that state investment created in the 1930s. Electrification is a marvelous, heroic story of the state deciding that people should be connected to a 250 volt, 240 volt AC system. And, you know, people of my age can remember farms in rural Carmarthenshire being connected at almost no cost to the farmer because it was determined that electrification was the future. It didn't pay the realistic cost of extending the line to your dairy so that it could work the milking machine instead of the Lister engine you had been using. And what we've lost is this capacity to think network, to think coordinated, which is central to all foundational activity. So we need to think about the regional as a space of coordination. And because the private sector utility model is to bring in the service and to take out the money. What else does a supermarket do? Trucks in groceries, vans out the money. It's as simple as that. What does it do for the regional economy? We need to think chain, because there's little gain from having a retailer or final assembler whose assembly chain behind is in chaos. Take, for example, Vauxhall Ellesmere Port. You'll no doubt have caught the national news where Vince Cable sat on a car at the end of the line and announced that the jobs were saved. What he didn't say was the factory's British content was 15% because its job is assembling imported German kits. For God's sake, think chain. Think non-profit. Because in this world of profit centres, if you install somebody to deliver shareholder value as Tesco or Sainsbury, you find they're trashing the supply network behind them and putting their processes in dairy and meat processing out of business. And you're also going to have to think about how the state acquires revenue sources, not only through new sources of tax on land and property, but also through doing what the Victorians did, which is getting cities to organise the provision of infrastructure. And the classic example of this is Joe Chamberlain in Birmingham, whose brand was called Gas and Water Socialism. Though Chamberlain that was ironic. He was in fact a right-wing, liberal and finally unionist, conservative politician. But he saw that people to deliver gas and water were the municipality, were the city. Go up to the reservoirs of the Lake District and think about the network thinking of the Manchester City Fathers. Go to the Elan Valley and think about how far ahead of their time the Birmingham City Fathers actually were. These people built networks for 100 years. Why can't we do the same now? Curb fragmentation. And then I think the second principle is to limit value extraction, which involves building regional financial circuits. Now, if you actually look at the economy as reconfigured by Thatcher and Blair, there are two aspects to that economy which are absolutely critical. First of which is it has toll booths everywhere. And secondly, it works by sucking money into and through London. If you think about the toll booths, the example I always give is of Trainline. You and I have always bought our tickets from Trainline. Most everybody here has bought tickets from Trainline. Trainline was originally set up as a co-op by the train operating companies. It bought out its major competitor. It was sold to private equity, and it charges me and you £1 on a transaction where one offers them a debit card number. The bank actually makes no charge when I use my debit card. Maybe it should. What's the transaction cost Trainline? Fractions, maybe 2 or 3p. It's an entirely digital transaction using no people at all. And it's not simply the train line. Your local PFI school is a toll booth where somebody is actually actually levying a toll on income as it goes through according to the contract under which the school was built. It's kind of peculiar that in the 1840s in Wales, we had the Rebecca riots and people dismantled the toll gates in Carmarthenshire and outside Wales. But everybody now seems to accept toll gates everywhere in the down economy. And the other thing that they accept is that when you have a pension fund or an insurance company, the money comes out, typically locally, out of a local authority wage, and goes to London where large deductions are actually made. And as you stand in Cardiff, the giant sucking sound that you hear is of the money crossing the Severn Bridge. And you know, you really need to start thinking about the financial flows that are involved in this economy. You've got national income accounting, which shows you the transfer payments coming in. But the national income accounting doesn't show you what you need to do, which is the money going out. If you look at the basic core utilities, gas, water, electricity and supermarkets, they're taking about £100 per week per household in Wales. And what have they done for us recently? I think that's a very serious question. And I think it's possible to think of a completely different economy, where, like our friends in Enfield, people were saying, well, why do we send the money into a pension fund which is managed for us in the City of London and gives us 5% when we could get 5% by building social housing in the locality? This is a society which hasn't built any social housing for 30 years. And if you look at local authority pension funds, I bet you, when we look at the Welsh ones, we'll find, like Enfield, they're earning no more than 5% net. And you really need to think about what kinds of useful things you could do for low and steady returns, which is the exact opposite of this kind of shareholder value capitalism which we've been sold for the last 30 years. So I come finally to the political challenge. Can the Welsh government do active regionalism? And at this point, I have to admit that, as so to speak, a non-Zionist Jew in relation to Wales, I do find my optimism is a bit limited. But please, let's clear some confusions out of the way. Let's not argue that the Welsh government needs to wait for more money and powers. I've handed round a flyer which is about what the London Borough of Enfield, a right-wing Labour council with 5 miles of derelict light industrial corridor running down the middle of the borough, is doing with less resource and power. You have all kinds of advantages. You have locals with leading edge ideas. We've got Keith Edwards on housing in the back. We've got Kevin on food in the front. The kind of agenda about a regionalised economy which is connected, not fragmented, and which stands against value extraction, they can actually help you plan that. And so we don't need more power. We need to change the limits on what's thinkable and doable. Secondly, please don't let's confuse active regionalism with Celtic nationalism. If you look at Celtic nationalism in the ascendant Scottish version, there are 2 preconditions. One, you're gambling on people having a cultural identity, and 2, you're gambling on your economic success. If you listened to Salmond after the devolution decision was announced, you know, his whole pitch is, we are the equal of the English and we'll do better by paddling our own canoe. The implication is, there's nothing in devolution and regionalism for the unsuccessful. Against that, I would say that if all else has failed, defensive, active regionalism is the policy that should be backed by every centre-left party in Wales. Indeed, it should in some ways be the test of whether you are running a centre-left party, is whether you can think of a coordinated network economy with less value extraction. And the first step on that road is to accept that you are losers under the current game. It is to some extent a kind of process which requires you to shed your illusions. It didn't work for 30 years before 2008, as the GVA gap shows. It's going to be much, much more unpleasant for the next 30 years. The Welsh are a nation of losers for the last 30 years unless they change the rules of the game. And the Enfield thing I photocopied and brought to you because it shows you can start doing things differently here and now. If within a year a right-wing Labour council in North London can plant 50 acres of glasshouses with waste heat from an incinerator, which they've accepted like Splot, because, you know, that's the kind of place where you site incinerators. If they can think of social housing from local authority pension plans, Wales should be doing 6 or 7 times more. I come finally to the limits of the Welsh political class. And, you know, praise the Lord, we are a public service nation. A nation led by a public sector, ambiguously a public service middle class. And I think this is self-criticism, because I myself come from this genealogy. And, you know, the whole thing is Rhodri Morgan, First Minister, son of Professor T.J. Morgan, brother of Priest Morgan, who taught at Swansea Uni but didn't get the chair. You know, do you know who his father is? As my father used to say as he sat in front of the TV in retirement. And the public sector middle class have really done very nicely out of the Thatcher-Blair experiment. Because essentially, while tradable goods collapsed, health, education and welfare expanded. And, you know, you could actually talk to the public sector middle class, and you talk to a room full of people who've never been redundant or unemployed in their lives. And this was part of a kind of division of labour, whereby the middle class managed the politico-social and spent public funds. And I speak here as the son of a vicar of Llanelli, whose mother was a grammar school teacher. That's the caste that I come from. And large-scale capital and private management was somebody else's business. It was the business of the English outsiders. You know, the people who lived in the Vale of Glamorgan and used to manage Scow when I was a kid. The people who are now running Circle, probably from some village in the Cotswolds, for all I know. And that essentially the problem that we face in this country, I think, is not that we lack a kind of cultural identity, but that we have a political class, a public sector middle class, a public service middle class, which is kind of geared up to spending the dividend of prosperity, not to taking hard economic choices in a process of decline. And so, in the end, I suppose, and this is a question for me, for you, for everybody, the fundamental existential question is, can the Welsh middle class escape this historic role division? And can they challenge received ideas as endorsed by the clerisy of economists, consultants, civil servants, and Westminster politicians? Thank you very much.